Brilliant, thanks, Peter. So we've now got Alexei from the British Red Cross, who's going to show us some interesting project with a nice plugin for QGIS around creating consistent grid layouts. Over to you, Alexei.
Hey, yeah, good. All right, thanks everyone. I'm Alexei. I am a technical advisor on the GIS team at British Red Cross, although I'm not actually speaking about British Red Cross here today. There's just a loose connection between my day job and this, which I'll explain. We'll talk about just the process I went through creating a plugin for QGIS as a non-software developer, because I thought people might find it interesting and might inspire people to do the same. So the link to my day job at British Red Cross is that part of that is training people to use QGIS, and typically we try and cram in quite a lot in quite a short amount of time. So that includes loading data, processing data, and then the cartography side as well, layout, symbology, and so on. And it's always a struggle to, a lot of that layout stuff, the graphic design side of things takes a lot of trial and error, something developed a lot over time. And I'm always trying to figure out what's a way to help people make good looking map layouts with minimal effort without necessarily having to get that same level of experience. And I'm thinking about things as well as the sort of symbology, colors, typography, but also good use of space, sort of balanced positions on the page, alignment, things like that. And thinking about ways to get this across to people, communicate it, started looking into graphic design methods, in particular looking at grid systems. This is a book cover of a book about grid systems in graphic design. Also, I don't know if that's Dutch or German, but it says raster system. That's referring to graphic design grids, not raster data. And an example of that, something that just pulled from online of someone like this is like a very classic 1950s Swiss style layout, all aligned to a kind of regular grid. So I was thinking, how can I kind of use this and help other people use this more easily in the QGIS layout editor? This is something I just threw together really quickly as an example. The kind of thing we might see people producing in a workshop. It's got all the right elements. Someone's going to tell me that's not the 7S3, it's the Bristol Channel. I didn't check. Sorry, I'm a terrible geographer. But all the right stuff's on there. It's just all a little bit misaligned and maybe just looks a little bit messy, even though it's not completely all over the place. That's another version of the same thing with just a little bit of alignment and spacing built in. And if I go forward, you can see that I've aligned it to a grid. We've got margins around the edges. You've got a regular grid and you've got little bits of spacing between the grid boxes, which is pretty big buttons. And so you can do this in QGIS. You can add these little red lines, grid layouts in the layout editor. But if you add more than like 4 or 6 or 8 or something, it's quite a painful process. It's not very ergonomic if you're you have to like click around a lot. It's not really built for like tab navigation. You've got to do quite a lot of like mental calculations or pen and paper calculations, and then like input them in with values. And if you make a mistake somewhere or you want to go back and edit something, it's just like quite annoying to work with. And if you want to kind of implement something like these kind of formal grid systems from graphic design concepts, you might be adding like 20, 30 guides to a layout. And it's just a pain to work with as it is in QGIS. So I started doing it manually, doing the calculations by hand, writing them all out and then inputting them into QGIS. And I thought there's got to be a better way to do this. So I've created a plugin. This is what it looks like. This is what you end up with. if you're eagle-eyed, you'll see that actually my plugin to help you with your layout on a grid is actually a little bit misaligned and not on a grid, so I need to fix that. But what you end up, you tell it how many columns you want, how many rows, and what spacing settings you want. You can select a page size, press OK, and it spits this out at you. And then what you've got is a layout that you can add elements to, and that QGIS will snap the elements to it and make it just that little bit easier, a little less painful to work with. So the way I went about it, in the blue box there at the bottom, that's essentially the Python code that does the calculations that I was doing with pen and paper and a calculator. It's, what is it, like six lines of code, and then everything else is just a wrapper around this. So it's super basic, and it was all, the process was mostly, it's not doing anything complex, it's just taking the input from the user and then understanding which QGIS elements to interact with through the Python API to get the end result. So I started off just making sure my calculations worked in just a standard Python terminal. And then once I got that working, I switched over to QGIS, opened up the QGIS Python prompt, which is the other window on this slide, and basically started playing around trying to figure out how to call the relevant parts of the API to make the changes I needed. So what's showing, probably can't see what's on there. That's just an example of like how to access the page size from the list of page sizes stored in the QGIS registry. So I was just spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to do things like that, how to create a layout, how to add guides procedurally, and so on. Once I got that figured out, I added the code into a plugin template, which I'll come back to. And then it was just a process of testing, running the plugin, putting in settings to it, clicking OK, seeing if it gave me an error or if it gave me something that I could see and see if it come out correctly. There were two plugins that if you watch anything about QGIS plugin development, you'll come across these. The first one is called Plugin Builder 3, developed by Gary Sherman, I think. Well, I think he's the original developer of QGIS. Yeah, lots of nods. I think it's a safe bet that his template's going to be pretty good. I think he also wrote a book on PyQGIS. I first used this, and it spits out a directory with lots of boilerplate code. And I was looking for it, and I was like, I don't understand any of this. I'm not even sure where to put my code. And I thought, tell you what, I'll just keep it simple. I'll just start from scratch and just like find a minimal version that my code works in. And after a few hours of trying to get that working, I was like, maybe I'll go back and use the template, which it turned out to be much easier. Most of it, for this simple purpose, most of the boilerplate you can kind of ignore and just fill in the main function where you want your program logic. So it seems a bit intimidating at first, but actually you don't, a lot of it's stuff you might want to do if you want to add translations later on, or yeah. The other plugin that's really useful is the plugin reloader plugin, which yeah, super simple. You just tell it which plugin you want to reload, and it just means every time you make changes to your plugin code, you don't have to recompile it and reinstall it. Just run the plugin reloader, and it does that. It speeds up testing new changes really quick by a lot. Like I said, I'm not a software developer. I am not an expert in PyQGIS or the QGIS code base. So I spent a lot of time looking for help. I found tutorials really useful. There's some good ones out there. There's some not good ones out there. And what I found interesting, I was interested in specifically the Python API for the layout editor. And there's not that much. Most of the tutorials focus on data loading, exporting data, processing, algorithms, and so on. There's not actually a lot that walks you through working with the layout editor. But I did find one quite big one, which is linked at the end of this. QGIS has pretty comprehensive Python API documentation, which is just great for understanding what options are available with different methods and what objects are available and so on. I know nothing about C++, but I did find there's also the Python C++ documentation, which is useful just for understanding some of the sort of names of elements or where they sit in the code base. And even though, so I've put an example here. So the next thing is the QGIS source code, which is all on GitHub. And so, for example, I was trying to get my head around, for example, where QGIS gets its list of paper sizes from. And so I thought, why don't I just search page size in the QGIS GitHub? It comes up with some files that use that in the file name. And what I found then was the C++ code to generate the list of paper size options. And then that pointed me in the right direction of where to look in the Python API to find the same functionality. So even though I didn't really understand the C++ code, it was useful for figuring out the Python API. Once I had something that was working, I wanted to make it available to other people. So I uploaded it to GitHub, set it to public. You create if you use the plugin builder plugin, you get prompted to create a lot of metadata as that part of that. So that kind of helps you with some of the metadata you need for the QGIS plugin repository. I also added some sort of what I hope is minimal but reasonably informative documentation to the GitHub page as a README. It really annoys me when you're browsing QGIS plugins and they have a one-line description and no screenshots. So I wanted to just provide a bit about how to use it and some screenshots of what to expect, so you don't have to install it and mess around yourself to understand what it does. And then I submitted it to the QGIS plugin repository. That's I think a manual review process, but they're pretty responsive. It was also quite useful to point out some mistakes I've made, like leaving the Python cache folder in the GitHub repo, for example. So just some useful sense checks from them. And then I published it. So the code is on GitHub there, and there's also a link to the QGIS plugin that you can also find it just by searching modular grid on the plugin repo. Our own gotchas, I guess it's more just like challenges and learning. There was a difference when I started experimenting with the Python API within QGIS. Found that when you're executing commands, QGIS does quite a lot of work for you. Like it does quite a lot implicitly in the background in terms of if you want to create a layout, it sort of you run the command and it creates it. Whereas if you do it in standalone script, you have to sort of assign it to a variable to make it persist. And that understanding that kind of interaction was something that took me a while to get my head around. The plugin structure, like I mentioned, there's quite a lot of boilerplate code, and understanding where to add your custom code in, which bits you need to customize and which bits you can ignore. Took a while to get my head around. Understanding how IQT links to the sort of Python code side. So I didn't. A lot of the documentation and tutorials will talk you through, how to create a GUI. It doesn't necessarily explain the logic behind it or how they interact. So that I found a little bit difficult to get my head around, and I found actually just reading the Qt documentation, standalone Qt documentation helped a little bit of that, even though it's not directly related to QGIS implementations. And yeah, how the Python API relates to, I don't know, data structure is probably the right word here, but the sort of how the code in QGIS is structured into objects and methods was a little bit unintuitive to me. So just getting my head around that, mostly through trial and error, understanding how to access things like paper sizes and creating a new layout and adding grid lines to a layout and things like that. So now that it's out there, it's not finished. So the great thing about putting it on GitHub is that people will test it and they'll tell you if you've messed things up. So someone added an issue saying it doesn't work in portrait layout, and I was like, oh, that's quite an oversight. So having it open source and having people able to just easily install it, test it, and let you know what's not working is great, because I'm one person, this is a hobby project, just kind of testing things out. It's great feedback for me to know what to improve and fix. There's some stuff I'd like to, now that I've got the basics, I'd like to add a few more features. I'd like to add a little image preview so you can see what you're going to create before you create it, and add maybe some templates of like common layouts, common settings. And now that I have a better understanding of how the layout guides work in the QGIS layout editor, I'm going to submit some feature requests to the QGIS project to make that process a bit less painful. Probably not something anyone's going to fund anytime soon, but who knows? And yeah, now that I've got a kind of like whet my appetite a little bit, I feel a bit more prepared to maybe like have a go at some of the other ideas I've got for QGIS plugins to solve similar, just little pain points that annoy me a little bit, and I'd like to make it a bit easier. And just to finish off, just a list of some resources that I found useful, some of the tutorials that I relied on the most, and some of the documentation links. Again, none of it's that hard to find. But yeah, like I say, maybe like slightly unintuitively, I found the C++ documentation and the Python T-docs quite helpful for just rounding out my understanding of places where the sort of Python focused docs didn't quite get me where I needed to get to. And yeah, that's all. Like, just wanted to basically share how I approach this as, like I say, I'm a software developer, so you know, a little bit of Python, and hope that if someone's thinking about, you know, oh, I'm not sure whether I would be able to do it, I just want to say you definitely can do it. It takes a bit of trial and error, and can be a bit frustrating at times, but it's definitely worth doing. And I'm sure if there's something that you find annoying with QGIS and want to round the edges off, other people would probably appreciate that as well. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alexei. Any questions? Yeah.
What do you use for debugging for the plugins?
So I don't have like a formal debugging process. It's trial and error, and yeah, like checking the error messages in QGIS and trying to look them up, understand them, and trying to address them.
Yeah, I want to suggest First Aid plugin.
First Aid. Okay.
First Aid, it's written by Martin Dobirac and Niall Dawson, who main contributes QGIS. And if you got any error or you want to set a breakpoint or see the variables during the run, it's like very easy to use, and it's a QGIS plugin. So
amazing. Yeah, I'll look that up. Thanks.
First Aid.
Great. Thanks very much, Alexei. So I suggest we draw